Hello YouTube and welcome to Raw History episode 4. So, the ancient Egyptians are probably the most famous and well known of all the ancient civilizations. Like, you may not recognize these or these, but I'm sure you know what this is. And even if you don't recognize this guy, you can be pretty confident that he was an ancient Egyptian. Names like Ramesses or Tutankhamun are better known than some 20th century leaders like William Taft or Warren Harding. And ancient Egypt has infiltrated our culture in an immensely significant way. Like, walk like an Egyptian. Yeah, but it almost never happened. In 1550 BCE, Egypt teetered on the brink of destruction, and were it not for one man, all of this may have gone extinct with it. So buckle up, it's gonna be fun. We don't need no education. Now 1550 is a very important date in ancient Egyptian history, but it's not the start of ancient Egyptian history. In fact, by this time, ancient Egypt and the pyramids were already ancient. The first pharaoh of Egypt began his rule in 3150 BCE, and the last pharaoh of Egypt, Cleopatra, died in 30 BCE. That is 3,120 years of ancient Egyptian civilization. Just to throw a little bit of perspective in there, the amount of time between the founding of Rome and the fall of Rome is just over 1 millennium. The Normans invaded Britain less than 1,000 years ago. Columbus set sail for America about 500 years ago, and the USA didn't declare independence until just over 200 years ago. There is a greater length of time between the first pharaoh and the last pharaoh than there is between the last pharaoh and now, by like over 1,000 years. In a timeline of all human civilization, ancient Egypt makes up more than half of it. So I'm saying all this because it's important to understand what it must have been like for the people living in Egypt in around 1550 BCE. They belonged to a civilization that had existed since, by their reckoning, the beginning of time, and there was a great sense of national pride in that. They built the pyramids and they were ruled over by gods, until disaster struck. By 1640 BCE, a foreigner sat on the Egyptian throne and declared himself Pharaoh. Egypt had never been invaded before, but now they were occupied by a strange new set of conquerors who called themselves the Hyksos. Egyptologists used to think that the Hyksos invaded Egypt in some military takeover, but new evidence suggests it was probably more a case of Hyksos merchants who emigrated from Canaan in the north into Egypt in the south, and they took advantage of the politically weak 13th dynasty until they were the de facto rulers of Egypt. After about 50 years, they made their presence official, and a man named Seletis became the first Hyksos pharaoh of Egypt. So before I talk about why 1550 is such a pivotal turning point, let's just spend a little bit of time getting to know the Hyksos, who were the first group of people to ever conquer the mighty ancient Egyptians. So as I've said, the Hyksos came from the lands of Canaan to the north of Egypt, which is kind of modern day Israel, Palestine, like Lebanon, Jordan, that kind of area. And when they came to Egypt, they moved the capital from Thebes in the south to a new city called Hutwaret in the north, which was later renamed Avaris by the Greeks. The Hyksos also brought a lot of technological advances to Egypt, including the composite bow, which was able to shoot farther and with more accuracy than the Egyptian bows, and they also brought deadlier axes, armour, stronger fortifications, and they gave Egypt the wheel in the form of chariots, which had never been seen in Egypt before. However, by far the most significant thing that the Hyksos brought with them was the creature pulling these chariots. Horses. Horses were completely alien to the people of Egypt, but in a very short period of time, they completely revolutionized trade and travel and communications and, of course, warfare. However, despite the fact that the Hyksos came from Canaan and they spoke a different language and had a different religion and had a different culture, they very skillfully assimilated themselves into Egyptian society, and in a few generations they had effectively gone native. This may explain why Hyksos rule was so successful, as they integrated their way of life with Egypt's, and they ruled with a comparatively light touch. I guess if an iron fist is hard rule, then the Hyksos ruled with more of a cotton fist. Maybe. But for many of the proud Egyptians, being ruled by a foreigner was just seen as too humiliating, and word of rebellion began to spread. And this brings us back to the old capital, Thebes, or modern-day Luxor, where the descendants of the old line of kings still ruled the upper kingdom, although they had to pay homage to the one true Hyksos pharaoh in the lower kingdom. Just a quick tangent, but it's very interesting that in Egypt, north was considered down and south was considered up. And that's because the Nile is one of the very rare rivers that flows from south to north, which means upriver is the upper kingdom and downriver, where the delta meets the sea, is the lower kingdom, despite being in the north, as it seems at the bottom of the country. However, back to the king of Thebes, who was a man called Seqenenre-Ptah, and for him there could be no Egyptian prosperity until the Hyksos were expelled from what he saw as his country. And so he initiated a number of small-scale rebellions against his Hyksos rulers. So there's a fun little anecdote here about how the skirmishes started. Apparently one day King Seqenenre-Ptah was out hunting hippos, which was a common but absurdly dangerous pastime in Thebes. During the hunt, a messenger from the Hyksos pharaoh Apophis, or Apipi, told Ptah that he was going to have to stop the hunt as the noise of the hippos dying was disturbing the pharaoh's rest all the way up in Hutwaret, which is relatively close to the modern-day capital Cairo. Now this is clearly nonsense, as Egypt is a big country and Thebes and Hutwaret are a long way from each other, and also hippos aren't that loud. But it was probably more symbolic, as hippos were associated with the storm and chaos god Set, who was worshipped by the Hyksos. Now, Ptah's wife was a woman called Ahotep, and she is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated people in this story. With Ahotep, Ptah had two sons, the warrior Kamos and the boy Akhmos, and they also probably had some daughters, but this is the ancient world and women weren't considered that important, so we don't know much about them. Sorry. But Ahotep was the one who urged her husband to seek independence, and in the end he rode out to meet the pharaoh in battle, and it ended amazingly badly. Ptah was slain in battle, as his grisly mummy shows us, and the torch was passed on to his eldest son, Kamos. However, as I already said, the Hyksos weren't particularly cruel dictators, and so for the everyday Egyptians that Kamos was calling upon to fight, they were kind of reluctant to rock the boat. I mean, things were going pretty well for them, especially by Bronze Age peasant standards. Kamos needed a cause that he could rally his people behind and use to justify a treasonous revolution. Fortunately for him, and unfortunately for the rest of Egypt, this cause came in the form of a message sent by the Hyksos pharaoh Apipi to the king of Nubia. Now, Nubia often gets forgotten, but it's an incredibly important area of land to the south of Egypt in what is modern-day Sudan. At this time, the people living in Nubia were called the Kushites, and they had been invaded by Egypt for generations, which actually, if you think about it, is very hypocritical that the Egyptians want their independence from the Hyksos, but they're not willing to give independence to the Kushites. I'm sure you can think of some other, more modern examples of this hypocrisy. Anyway, so Pharaoh Apipi sent this secret message to the king of the Kushites, suggesting that the Kushites attack Egypt from the south and the Hyksos will attack from the north, and together they will crush Kamos together in like a little enemy sandwich. It's kind of sort of the same as if Canada was sending secret messages to Mexico, saying that they both attack the US at the same time. However, the Pharaoh's message never actually made it to the Kushites, as one of Kamos's agents intercepted it upon the road. Once Apipi's plans were made public, Egypt was plunged into a war, but it was a war that Kamos did very, very well in. Despite his youth, the new king of Thebes led his armies very effectively, and he made it abundantly clear what his plans were for his enemies. I sit united with an Asiatic and a Nubian, each in possession of his slice of Egypt. No man can settle down when despoiled by the taxes of the Asiatics. I will grapple with him that I may rip open his belly. My wish is to save Egypt, and to smite the Asiatic. And surprisingly for politicians, Kamos did more or less exactly what he said he was going to do. First, he fought and defeated the Kushites in the south, and then he turned his attentions north towards the capital. Over a 5-year reign, Kamose united almost all of Egypt, until, in 1550 BCE, him and his army stood outside the walls of Hutwaret, ready to expel the invaders. However, Kamose never took Hutwaret. We don't know exactly what happened, but in 1550, Kamose died. He was so close to fulfilling his father's legacy, but standing just out of reach of the crown, the young prince met his end. And Thebes lost. The Hyksos recovered from their defeats and retook control over Egypt. The Theban rebellion was put down, and it looked as though Egypt would never be ruled by an Egyptian pharaoh ever again. Although this isn't quite as dramatic as I'm making it sound, because this video is called The Dawn of Egypt's Golden Empire, and so, spoiler alert, it's not quite over yet. Remember Queen Ahotep, the wife of Ta-Seqenenre? Well, the good news is that she had one more trick up her sleeve. The bad news is that that trick was her son, Prince Akhmos, who was only 8 years old. But nevertheless, that didn't stop her. Ahotep raised Akhmos on stories of his father and brother and their noble campaigns against the enemy, and when he finally came of age, he took up his sword and chariot and redeclared war upon the Hyksos. By the age of 25, Akhmos had completely expelled the Hyksos, and he became the unifier of Egypt as well as the first king of the 18th dynasty, which ushered in a new golden age of the Egyptian Empire. So, just before we finish, I think it's really important to know how Akhmos defeated the Hyksos, and also how Egypt became so powerful over the next 1,000 years. It was all because Akhmos fitted his army with Hyksos technology and weapons. He took the chariots and armour and bows of his enemies and perfected them until they could be used against their inventors. For 1,000 years after, Egypt continued to build its golden empire under the rules of men like Tutankhamun and Akhenaten and Ramesses II, who all contributed greatly to ancient Egypt becoming the historical monolith that it is known to be today. However, none of them could have done this without the victories of Akhmos. But perhaps more interestingly, Akhmos himself could not have done this without the Hyksos in the first place. There's probably a really important message somewhere in all of this. Could it be that whenever we're invaded by a Bronze Age civilization, or, you know, whatever other problems you face on a daily basis, the solution can be found within the setback itself? And maybe, just like with the ancient Egyptians, we'll all be stronger because of it. Although, actually, from the Hyksos perspective, the moral of the story is if you want to invade someone, don't share your technology, and also be more of an asshole so they don't dare rebel. But let's be optimistic and, you know, go with the first thing. So I'm afraid that's all I have time for today, but please feel free to keep the discussion going in the comments section below, and if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss next week's Raw History video. And my head scratcher for this episode is, when someone says new and improved, which one is it? Is it brand new, or is it an improved version of an older thing? As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next week.